Keeper of the Lost Cities, EXILE, Chapter 12. This is who we are trusting with the most important creature on our planet? A sharp voice barked as Sophie flayed in the stinky waste, which was surprisingly glittery. Apparently, she'd found the one thing sparkles didn't make better. And if she weren't already nauseous from the wild flight and the gagging smell of manure, the sound of that voice would have done it. Sophie wiped the shimmering poop off her cheek as she stood to face not just Bronte, a small elf with cropped brown hair and features as sharp as his voice, but the entire elven council in full real grab, standing just outside the enclosure. Sophie dipped an ungraceful curtsy and stared at the circlets, each encrusted with different colored jewels to match the elegant capes. She tried to remember the names, but it was hard when they weren't in front of the conveniently labeled thrones in the tribunal hall. She could only recognize 5 of them. 2 goblin bodyguards flanked the group on each side, and next to the closest one stood Alden, his lips twitching with the smile he was fighting back. "Yes, Bronte," Alden said, offering Sophie a silky handkerchief from a pocket in his navy blue cape. "And Sophie is more than worthy of the task. Though we've caught her in the middle of some excitement." Sophie's face burned as she moved closer and reached through the purple bars to accept the handkerchief. The stench followed her with every step, and all the silky cloth did was smear the filth more. "So you can fly with Sylvie?" Alden asked, a hint of awe in his voice. "Apparently," Grady answered for her as he exited the enclosure and approached the councillors. He inclined his head in a slight bow. "To what do we owe this honor?" "I know we come unannounced," Councillor Emery, the spokesman for the council, said in his deep, booming voice. His eyes were the same shade as the sapphires covering his circlets, and his shoulder-length hair was almost as dark as his skin. "We were eager to see this remarkable discovery for ourselves." The others murmured in agreement, their eyes glued to Sylvie, who was preening the feathers on her glistening wings, looking gleaming and majestic, and without a single fleck of poop on her anywhere. Sophie started plotting revenge. "Can you really communicate with her?" Kenrick asked. With his vivid red hair and wide shoulders, he was the easiest to recognize, and one of Sophie's favorite members on the council, thanks to his warm smile. "Not only can they communicate," Grady answered for her, "but Sophie discovered this morning that Sylvie can transmit to her, even when she's trying to block her." Several councillors gasped. Alden frowned. "Most curious." "Indeed," Councillor Terek said, sweeping back his wavy brown hair. Sophie remembered him from their private consultation a few months back. He was a descrier, able to sense and interpret potential, and the council had ordered him to take a reading of her. Unfortunately, all he'd felt was something strong, and hadn't been able to translate what it meant. "How did you find her?" he asked, his cobalt blue eyes focused so intently on Sophie, she felt like he was trying to take another reading. "It was kind of an accident," she admitted. She explained how she'd followed Sylvie's thoughts, assuming they came from the Sasquatch. Sylvie trotted to her side as she spoke, and Sophie pretended not to see her, not ready to forgive her for the manure situation. "Incredible," Councillor Terek breathed as Sylvie nudged Sophie, refusing to be ignored. "Our long-lost elf and the most searched-for creature on the planet, stumbling across each other in the middle of a forest in the Forbidden Cities. It's most impossible to believe there were no other forces to play, especially when you consider the unique connection the two appear to have. It seems unlikely that it happened purely by chance. Counselor Emery cleared his throat. Are you implying that someone intended for Sophie to find the alicorn? His words seemed to swell in Sophie's mind. She stared into Sylvie's watery brown eyes that were almost the same color as hers, eyes that stared back at her with an intensity and intelligence like no other animal she'd ever encountered, eyes that belonged to an animal who could break through her mental blocking in ways even elves couldn't. Had she been led by the black swan specifically to find her? It's impossible. Orelai's fragile voice announced, shattering the silence everyone had fallen into. The blonde beauty in a cape and circlet, the same soft pink as her rosy cheeks, shook her head as she stepped forward and added, no one could orchestrate such a feat, not even the black swan. Orelai's right, Kenrick agreed. We've been censuring for another alicorn for decades. Centuries, Alden corrected, without even the slightest hint that another might exist. Are you suggesting the black swan has been hiding Sylvie all this time, risking that the other alicorn would expire before they could reproduce? When you put it that way, it does sound rather absurd, Councillor Terrick admitted. But surely you can agree that it's a stunning coincidence, especially considering that this completely resets the timeline. What does that mean? Sophie asked, squirming as all eyes turned back to her. Hasn't anyone educated this child in the fundamental principles of our world? Bronte shook his head so dramatically that his ancient ears wiggled. Elven ears turned pointy as they aged, which meant prominent points like Bronte's were a sign of wisdom and experience. But to Sophie they looked far too much like the cheap costume ears she used to see humans wear when they pretended to be elves, usually paired with tights and shoes with bells on the toes. Councillor Terrick was referring to the timeline to extension, Alden said, reminding Sophie that there were far more important things to think about than pointy ears. With only one alicorn in our care, and no guarantee that we'd ever find another, we've been facing with the very real possibility that this majestic species would someday go extinct. He whispered the last word, like it was too horrible to say at full volume. The elves believed that every creature on earth existed for a reason, and to let one die off and cause irreversible damage to the planet's delicate balance. That was why they'd built the sanctuary and worked so hard to protect and conserve the creatures humans thought were either myths or lost. But now all of that has changed, Councillor Terrick added quietly. Everything has changed. Indeed it has, Councillor Emery agreed, and it couldn't have happened at a better time. This is exactly the kind of discovery that will restore calm and order to our world, the symbol of hope and stability we've been waiting for. Sylvie nudged Sophie again, filling the air with her rancid breath. Sophie couldn't believe such a stinky, stubborn creature was so important. All the more reason why the alicorn's care should be entrusted to experts. Look at her! Sophie's cheeks flamed as Bronte pointed a bony finger at her sparkly poop-covered floats. We are looking, Councillor Emery replied. The alicorn trusts her completely, and Adeline and I are here to help her, Grady added. We have years of experience. Bronte snorted. Two of our world's most scandalous misfits. Oh yes, I feel much better. Need I remind you that mere months ago that Reuven name was utterly uttered only with ridicule and scorn? How many years have you isolated yourself at the estate, letting the rumours spread of your madness without bothering to deny them? He turned to face the councillors, and how can we forget the day he stood before us and dared to accuse us of neglectful rulership before renouncing his title as an emissary? What right does he have to demand our trust, especially now when our every decision is being scrutinized by a disconcerted public? Sophie fidgeted in the deafening silence that followed. She'd known that most of the elves had found Grady and Adeline were weird. She'd heard plenty of gossip when she was first assigned to live with them, but they'd pulled away from everyone because they'd lost their only daughter and had to care for Brant in a world where almost no one knew how to relate to their grief. Couldn't the council understand that? Things have changed, Bronte, Alden said quietly. We've all seen the transformation in Grady and Adeline since Sophie came to live with them and with... Oh, we have we? Bronte interrupted. Granted, they leave the house a bit more, though several of those times were merely to attend Miss Foster's tribunals. Sophie cringed at the word. But they still avoid participating in regular society. And hasn't Grady repeatedly turned down our request that he returned to his position as emissary, a position that would greatly aid in our efforts to stop the organization that seems to harm a member of his own family? Another moment of awkward silence passed, and this time Councillor Emery rubbed his temples, probably moderating telepathic discussions between the councillors. Sophie had a feeling she knew what questions they must be asking, the same ones she'd been trying not to ask herself these last few weeks. Why didn't Grady become an emissary again? Didn't he want to help them catch the kidnappers? Bronte does raise an interesting point, Grady, Councillor Emery finally said. It would do much to instill public confidence in our decision to let Sophie rehabilitate the Alicon if you reclaim your title as emissary. Would you be willing to accept the appointment? Say yes, Sophie thought, wishing she could transmit the words but daring to interfere. Please say yes. Maybe if Grady had looked her in her eyes, he would have seen the hope she was hiding. But he didn't look at her, or at anyone, as he folded his arms and said the word that felt like a slap to Sophie's heart. No.